I'm Will Walker, one of the editors of the journal New York History, and I'm here with Stephen Light, who's the author of Love at War, The Civil War Courtship of John L. Hoster and Josephine Cole, which is an article in the current issue of New York History. Many of Steve's key sources came from the New York State Historical Association, and so we're going to take some time to look at those sources today. But before we do that, I just want to ask you, Steve, to tell us a little bit about John Hoster and Josie Cole.
Sure. John and Josie were two individuals who were from Seneca County, New York. They were from the small village of Canoga, and during the Civil War they pursued a courtship, which is the main subject of my article. But the Civil War was something that affected both of their lives greatly. In 1861, John was 19 years old at the time. Josie was 16, and the two grew up in farm families at the time in Canoga. John enlisted in Company A of the 148th New York Volunteers in September of 1862. Went to war where he served for the duration, and actually for a time in 1864 and 1865 was a prisoner of war in Confederate prisoner of war camps, including Andersonville, which was one of the more notorious prisoner of war camps during the war. Josie on the home front the war had a great impact on her life as well. Her father died during the war. Her family faced some rough circumstances. She became a school teacher to earn some extra money for her family at that time. At the close of the war, they did end up marrying each other.
Great, so it sort of has a happy ending.
It does.
Although John certainly suffered quite a bit.
Yes, he did suffer quite a bit, especially in Andersonville and other prison camps. For the first part of the war, the 148th New York was stationed around Suffolk, Virginia, which was certainly not where all the action was. There were some engagements and some campaigning around there, but for the most part, for his first few years of service, he didn't see much action at all. It was more of a garrison soldier. In 1864, that changed. He and the 148th did see action in some small engagements, and then beginning with the Battle of Cold Harbor, they were essentially part of the main theater of war in Virginia. He did participate in the Battle of Cold Harbor, and then just a few days later, on June 15th of 1864, he was captured outside of Petersburg. And that began a very difficult time for both John and Josie, because as he was in a Confederate prisoner of war camp, there was virtually no contact between him and his family, as well as Josie, who he was corresponding with at the time they were engaged. He spent 3 months in Andersonville and spent several more months right up until February of 1865 in Confederate prisoner of war camps with some pretty horrific conditions.
Well, so it's appropriate that you are talking about Andersonville, because Hoster writes quite a bit about Andersonville in his diary. So why don't we take a look now at John Hoster's diary. And what can you tell us about this? What kinds of things did Hoster write about in his diary?
Yeah, this was certainly one of my main sources for the article. Hoster kept a daily diary from the very beginning of his service in September of 1862 all the way through the last day of the war. And there's lots of terrific material in those diaries. There's actually 5 diaries in all. He writes about daily camp life. He writes about his impressions of civilians he meets, of African Americans, slaves that he meets in the South, impressions of his other comrades. He writes a lot about his day-to-day activities, which is kind of interesting to explore the differences early in the war when he's not really engaged in combat versus when the 148th does become engaged in 1864. He also is very prolific letter writer as well, and actually one of the other main sources that I talk about is his letters between him and Josie throughout the war. In June of 1864, when he becomes a prisoner, his letter writing is essentially cut off, so his diary entries while he's in a Confederate prison camp become very detailed, and it's really fascinating to see what life was like in these prison camps. He details the food, the squalor, the terrible conditions, talks about the illnesses and the deaths of other soldiers.
It seems in a way that maybe writing in his diary was kind of a survival mechanism?
Yeah, I absolutely think it was, and you can see that reflected through his writings, particularly while he is a prisoner. He writes daily entries, many of them are very detailed. You can kind of get a feel for what John is thinking as he goes through the war. When he becomes sick, as he does several times through his service, the entries get very nondescript, and in some cases he'll write an entry that only has one sentence, and it's during his illnesses that you can kind of see how he's not feeling well, he's not up to writing, but you can also see where he uses his writing as a coping mechanism, as you say. When his ability to write letters home is taken away from him, his diary entries become very, very detailed, because that is how he kind of copes and deals with the stress of what his experiences in those prison camps.
So, what do you think in general to kind of sum things up? The diary and the letters can tell us about the experience of Union soldiers during the Civil War.
Well, these diaries you can explore any number of different topics. I think with John Hoster's diaries, you can talk about the day-to-day experiences of the Civil War soldier. You can explore how life was different for a soldier who was in an active combat area versus a soldier who was in a little bit more of a quieter area. John has a number of entries in his diary that talks about his religious practices, camp prayer meetings, and how the soldiers explored religion in camp. So certainly that's a topic that you can cover. Probably what I found most interesting about the diaries in terms of the soldier's life was the prisoner of war experience. The detail that he talks about the diet, the nutrition, the camp conditions, even some of the medical care. It was very fascinating and provides a real look into the sufferings that some of those soldiers went into, or some of those soldiers faced in those particularly Confederate prisoner of war camps, but also Confederate prisoners based in northern camps as well.
Well, thanks so much, Steve, for talking about these sources here and giving us a really deep interpretation of the sources and these two fascinating figures, John Hoster and Josephine Cole.
Thanks, Will.